Hello everyone, and welcome to the Midnight Storyteller. If you're new here, welcome. If you're back, it's good to have you. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's begin.
The storm outside howled against the windows as Mark sat alone in his apartment, the dim glow of his laptop screen the only source of light. It had been a long day, and he was about to turn in for the night when his phone vibrated on the table. A single text message lit up the screen. "Look outside." His heart skipped a beat. The message had no sender. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he hesitated to reply. A prank, maybe? Someone messing with him? He slowly turned his head toward the window, his pulse quickening. The street below was empty. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the flickering streetlights. No one was there, just the wind pushing against the trees, their shadows swaying unnaturally. Then his phone vibrated again. "I see you." Mark felt a cold chill creep up his spine. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the dark corners. Was someone watching him? His apartment was on the 3rd floor. How could anyone be outside his window? He forced out a shaky breath and typed back, "Who is this?" No response. Only silence. He grabbed his phone and stood up, cautiously approaching the window. He pressed his face to the cold glass, scanning the street once more. The empty road stretched into the distance. No cars, no people, nothing. Then his screen lit up again. "You're looking the wrong way." Mark spun around so fast he nearly fell backward. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes darted across the room. The closet door was slightly open. He hadn't left it that way. He was sure of it. His fingers tightened around his phone as he slowly approached the closet, the wooden floor creaking beneath his weight. His own breathing sounded too loud in the quiet apartment. He reached out, hand trembling, and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just his clothes hanging limply on their racks. The darkness inside felt heavier than it should. He exhaled shakily, letting out a nervous chuckle. Just then, another message came through. Too slow. Mark's blood turned to ice. A sharp creak echoed behind him, the sound of a footstep. He turned just in time to see movement in the reflection of his bedroom mirror. A figure. Tall. Gaunt. Its face was wrong, distorted, stretched too wide in a grotesque grin. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, and before Mark could even scream, the figure lunged. Darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, Mark's apartment was quiet. The storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. His phone lay abandoned on the table, the screen cracked. A single message remained open. "Found you." But Mark was gone. His apartment was empty, as if he had never been there at all. The old house on the corner of Maple Street had always been there, standing like a forgotten relic, its paint peeling, windows clouded with dust. No one ever moved in. No one ever moved out. It just existed. One night, Olivia walked past it on her way home. The wind carried a faint whisper through the trees, something almost like her name. She paused, glancing toward the house. The porch light was on, but the house had been abandoned for years. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from an unknown number. "Come inside." Her breath hitched. She turned sharply, scanning the street. Empty. A chill ran down her spine, but she told herself it was nothing, just a prank, a coincidence. She picked up her pace, determined to ignore the unease creeping up her back. Then the second message came. "Don't run." She did. Her heart pounded as she sprinted down the sidewalk, her footsteps echoing against the quiet night. The streetlights flickered. The wind howled. When she reached her apartment, she fumbled with her keys, shoved open the door, and slammed it behind her. Safe. She let out a shaky breath, pressing her forehead against the cool wood. Her phone buzzed again. "You're home." "Good." Her stomach dropped. Slowly she turned. The apartment was dark, exactly as she had left it. Nothing was out of place. But something felt wrong. She locked the door, double-checking it before backing away, her eyes darting to the windows. Then she saw it. A figure. Standing just outside her window. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her. She took a step back. Her phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The figure moved. Not forward, not to the side. It glitched. 1 second, it was outside. The next, it was inside. Olivia stumbled backward, a scream rising in her throat. The figure stood just a few feet away now, its face shrouded in shadow. Her phone vibrated once more. With shaking hands, she picked it up. Too late. The lights flickered, the shadows twisted, and then darkness. The next morning, Olivia's apartment door stood ajar. Her phone lay on the floor, the screen cracked, the last message still glowing. But Olivia was gone. And the house on Maple Street? Its porch light was off, waiting. The moment he stepped into the alley, the strange sensation washed over him. The feeling of being watched. It was late, and the city was quiet, but something about the dimly lit street made him uneasy. His eyes darted around, scanning the shadows, but there was no one there. Just the faint hum of streetlights and the distant sound of traffic. But that feeling, the creeping sensation at the back of his neck, wouldn't go away. He quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space between the crumbling buildings. As he walked, the alley seemed to stretch, the walls closing in on him. He looked over his shoulder again, feeling the presence of someone following him. But no one was there. It wasn't until he reached the end of the alley that he noticed something strange. A small door, half hidden behind a stack of old crates. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but the rusted handle beckoned him. Without thinking, he reached for it. The door creaked open, revealing a small room. His curiosity piqued, he stepped inside. The room was dark and musty, with only a single light bulb swinging above. Dust hung thick in the air, and the floor was littered with discarded items, a broken chair, a pile of old newspapers, and something that looked like a bundle of clothes. He squinted, trying to make out the details. But before he could take another step, the door slammed shut behind him. The sudden noise sent a shock of adrenaline through his body. He spun around, trying to open the door, but it was locked. Panic surged as he tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. That's when he heard the noise, the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him. His heart raced as he slowly turned around. In the corner of the room, a figure stood motionless. He couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a person. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, revealing a face that made his stomach churn. It was a face he recognized, but it wasn't his own. The figure's eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to stare right through him. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and the corners of its mouth curled into an eerie smile. He took a step back, stumbling over a pile of old crates. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice low and rasping, like it had been buried for years. The room seemed to shrink as the figure took another step forward. His mind raced. He had to get out of there. But no matter where he turned, the figure was always there, its empty eyes locked onto him. The smell of decay hit him then, a sickening, overpowering stench that made his stomach twist. He turned again, his fingers trembling as they scrambled over the door handle. But still it wouldn't open. The figure moved closer, its face now just inches from his. He could feel its cold breath on his skin, sending a chill down his spine. "You should have stayed away," it whispered, its voice almost a growl. He tried to fight, to push the figure away, but his hands passed right through it, like it wasn't even real. His mind spun, panic setting in as he realized something far more terrifying. This wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. With a final guttural laugh, the figure reached out and touched his face. The world around him blurred, spinning wildly, until he collapsed onto the cold, dusty floor. The last thing he saw before his vision faded was the figure standing over him, its hollow eyes now staring down with a twisted satisfaction. When he woke up, the alley was gone. The room was gone. He was back in his apartment, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. The door to his room was still locked, just like it always was. But something was wrong. Something in the air felt heavy, thick with the same oppressive presence he had felt in that room. He ran to the mirror, trying to shake the feeling off, but when he looked into it, his reflection wasn't his own. Instead, the hollow-eyed figure stared back at him, a grin stretching across its face. The same twisted smile, and it was smiling at him, because it had finally found him. It started with the knocking. Soft at first, just a gentle tap, tap, tap against the bedroom window. Mia ignored it, assuming it was the wind or maybe a stray branch scraping the glass. But the next night, It came again. Tap, tap, tap. She lived on the 4th floor. There were no trees near her window. That was the first time she felt it, the creeping sensation of being watched. She tried to rationalize it, maybe a bird, maybe the pipes in the walls. But deep down, something felt wrong. The knocks weren't random. They came in patterns. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more taps, like someone was trying to get her attention. One night, curiosity got the better of her. She turned off her bedroom light and crept toward the window, heart pounding. The city outside was quiet, bathed in pale moonlight. Nothing seemed out of place, and then she saw it, a face. Pale, gaunt, pressed against the glass from the outside. Its eyes were wide, black pits, and its mouth was twisted into a grin too large for its face. Mia's breath caught in her throat. It was upside down, like it was hanging from the roof. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her bed. When she looked again, nothing. Just the empty night sky. Had she imagined it? She barely slept, every nerve on edge. But for a while the knocking stopped, until a week later. She was brushing her teeth, the steam from her shower fogging up the bathroom mirror. She wiped it with her hand, expecting to see her own reflection staring back. Instead, she saw him, the same hollow-eyed man from the window, standing behind her, grinning. She screamed and spun around. Nothing. Just the empty bathroom. The mirror was completely fogged over again. She should have left then. Packed her bags, run. But she convinced herself it was just stress, lack of sleep. The mind plays tricks, right? That night, she locked her bedroom door, pulled the covers over her head, tried to block it all out. But at 3 a.m., the knocking returned. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the window, it was coming from inside her closet. Tap, tap, tap. Slow. Deliberate. Mia's breath hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to move, not to breathe. Then, the door creaked open. She felt it. The air shifted, the temperature dropped, something was in the room with her. And then, a whisper, right next to her ear. I let myself in. Mia shot out of bed, scrambling for the light switch. When she flipped it on, the room was empty. The closet door was wide open. But something was wrong. The window was now unlocked, and in the reflection of the glass, a grin too wide, eyes too dark, he was already inside. The sun had long disappeared behind the horizon, and the small town of Glenmore had already settled into the quiet that came with the late hours of the night. But something was different tonight. A lingering sense of unease hung in the air, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Emma, a newcomer to the town, had been warned about the old house at the end of Maple Street. Stay away from it, they said. No one dares go near it. But Emma, curious and skeptical of local superstition, decided to take a walk that evening and see the house for herself. She had heard the stories, the ones about the house being haunted, about strange occurrences that would send shivers down anyone's spine. But Emma wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. She had always been rational, always sought logical explanations for anything that couldn't be easily understood. So when she arrived at the house, she stood across the street, peering at the eerie silhouette outlined against the moonlit sky. The house was massive, its dark windows like eyes that seemed to watch her every move. The exterior was decaying, with the once grand facade now covered in ivy and grime. The air around it felt heavier than it should have, like something was pressing in on her from all sides. Emma scoffed, shaking her head. Just an old house, she thought. Nothing more. She crossed the street slowly, her footsteps muffled by the dense grass growing wild around the yard. As she got closer, the unsettling feeling only grew stronger, as though the house was calling out to her. She could almost feel the weight of its history pressing on her chest, the secrets it held behind its crumbling walls. But Emma was determined. She stepped up to the front door, which was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Without thinking, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The musty scent of mold and dust filled her nose, and the sound of creaking wood echoed through the halls. The floor beneath her feet groaned with each step she took, as if the house itself was alive, shifting with every movement. The air was thick with a strange stillness, the kind of quiet that made her feel as though she were intruding on something she wasn't meant to see. As she ventured deeper into the house, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with each step, and her breath became visible in the air. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one there. "It's just my imagination," she told herself. But then she heard it. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, like a voice carried on the wind. She froze, her heart racing in her chest. The whisper was followed by another, clearer this time, and then another. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone, there was something desperate about it, something pleading. Emma's skin prickled with a cold sweat as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. She spun around, her pulse pounding in her ears. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her veins as the whispers grew louder, now unmistakable. They were calling her name. "Emma!" A chill ran down her spine. Her breath hitched in her throat as she stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall. She could feel the weight of invisible eyes on her, as though the house itself was aware of her presence and watching her every move. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thickening, the floor beneath her feet trembling. And then, in the dim light, she saw them. Shadows moving along the edges of the room. At first, they were nothing more than flickers in the corner of her vision. But soon they took shape, becoming more defined with each passing second. Figures, ghostly, translucent, but unmistakable, began to emerge from the dark corners of the room. They were people, or at least they had once been. Their faces were contorted in expressions of agony, their eyes hollow, vacant. They floated toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were struggling to break free from some unseen force. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move, but her legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The figures closed in on her, their outstretched hands reaching for her with terrifying speed. She could feel the coldness radiating from them, the oppressive energy that surrounded them. One of the figures, a woman, stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Emma's with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The woman's mouth opened, but instead of words, a low, guttural sound emerged, like a whisper from deep within the earth. "Leave, now, or you'll stay." Emma's eyes widened in horror as she realized the terrifying truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a prison for the souls of those who had entered it, never to leave. And now she had become one of them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the figures closed in, their hands brushing against her skin. She could feel the chill of death, the suffocating presence of the house wrapping itself around her like a vice. And just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard one last whisper. This time, not from the figures, but from somewhere else, somewhere deep within the house. "Welcome home." In that moment, Emma realized she was never meant to leave. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed everyone before her. The door to the house remained shut, and no one would ever hear from Emma again. The smell hit them first. It wasn't just the stench of decay, it was something worse, something that crawled into your lungs and stayed there, thick and putrid. The officer standing at the doorway gagged, covering his nose with his sleeve. They all knew something terrible was waiting inside, but none of them were prepared for what they were about to find. The house was silent, except for the faint creaking of floorboards under their boots. The walls were lined with old, yellowed wallpaper, peeling in places. The furniture was covered in dust, as if no one had lived there for years. But someone had, and that someone had left behind something monstrous. They found the first one in the living room. A body, or what was left of it, was propped up in a chair. The skin was stretched too tightly over its frame, stitched together crudely, like a macabre piece of art. But it wasn't just skin. The officers' stomachs twisted as they realized what they were looking at. It was a suit made from human flesh. The second body was in the kitchen. This one wasn't displayed like the first. It was discarded, carelessly dumped in the corner, its torso completely skinned. The missing flesh had been used. The lid detective forced himself to breathe. They had heard stories, rumors about the man who lived here, whispers of missing people who were last seen near this house. But no one had ever proven anything. Until now. They moved deeper into the house, their hands gripping their guns tightly. Then they heard it. A soft, wet squelching sound. It was coming from the basement. No one wanted to go down there. But they had no choice. The stairs groaned under their weight as they descended, flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The smell grew stronger, nearly unbearable. And then, in the dim light, they saw him. The man was hunched over a wooden work table, his back to them. His hands moved methodically, carefully, as if he were sewing fabric together. Only it wasn't fabric. It was skin, pale, raw, freshly removed. He was making another suit. The moment their lights hit him, he froze. Slowly he turned around, and he was wearing it. The skin of his latest victim draped over his body like a second layer, stitched together with jagged black thread. The flesh on his face was uneven, mismatched, the mouth twisted in a permanent, grotesque grin. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man smiled. Not through the stolen face, through his own. A twisted, horrifying smile that sent ice through their veins. "You finally found me," he whispered. The silence shattered. The officers lunged forward, shouting commands, but the man didn't run. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he reached for something on the table, a knife, still dripping with blood. They fired. The first bullet hit him in the shoulder. The second in the chest. He stumbled back, his grotesque suit sagging, the stitches pulling apart at the seams. But he was still smiling. Even as he collapsed to the floor, his breathing ragged, he laughed. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said something that would haunt them forever. "This isn't my first skin." His head tilted slightly, his eyes locking onto the detectives. "And it won't be my last." The room fell into suffocating silence. Then, finally, he stopped breathing. The officers stood frozen, staring at the horror before them. But none of them noticed the closet door behind them. None of them heard the faint sound of fabric shifting. None of them saw the extra suit, waiting in the shadows. The woods were quiet, eerily quiet. James had been hiking for hours, and the dense trees around him felt as if they were closing in, the shadows deepening with every step. He had been to this trail before, but something felt different today. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He checked his map, only to realize he had veered off the main path. The trail markers weren't where they should be. Panic began to settle in, but he pushed it away. Just another shortcut, he thought. I'll be fine. I've hiked this trail 100 times before. But as he continued, the familiar sounds of the forest faded. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled, no wind blew through the branches. It was as if the entire world had gone still. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a primal warning he couldn't shake off. Then he saw it, an overgrown path leading off to the right, one that wasn't on the map. Curiosity overtook him, and against his better judgment, he decided to follow it. It was hidden behind thick underbrush, as if no one had walked here in years. The deeper he went, the more isolated he felt. The trees seemed to close in tighter, the sky growing dimmer. After a while, he came to a clearing. The air grew colder, an unsettling chill that crept up his spine. In the center of the clearing, he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. A cemetery, an old, forgotten one. The stones were weathered, cracked, some barely legible, but what really struck him was the fresh earth. Several mounds of dirt lay disturbed, as if graves had been recently dug. James approached cautiously, his pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. He knelt by one of the graves and touched the earth. It was still soft. Someone had been buried here recently. His mind raced. This part of the woods was supposed to be abandoned, not just in disrepair, but entirely forgotten. How could there be fresh graves? His breathing became shallow as a creeping dread began to rise within him. He stood up quickly, glancing around, feeling like something was watching him. The hairs on his neck prickled, and he swiveled his head, scanning the trees for any movement. But there was nothing. And then he heard it. A faint noise, like soft whispers carried on the wind. He turned his head sharply, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though he couldn't make out any words. His heart raced, and a chill spread through his chest. Without thinking, he took a step back, and that's when he noticed something even stranger. The gravestones weren't random, they were arranged in a perfect circle. Around the perimeter, hidden behind trees and bushes, were old, weathered toys. Dolls, teddy bears, and trinkets, just scattered around the graves. Their eyes, once bright, now dull and empty, seemed to stare at him. The whispers grew louder, and James couldn't ignore it anymore. He turned to run, but before he could take another step, he froze. There, standing in the shadows at the far end of the clearing, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and barely visible, the figure seemed to be watching him, unmoving, as though it had always been there, waiting. "Who's there?" James called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It only stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Every step it took felt heavier, like it was trudging through thick mud. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, but James could see the pale hands, gnarled and skeletal, reaching out toward him. The whispers intensified as the figure came closer, now mere feet from him. James's breath caught in his throat. There was no escape. He had walked into something ancient, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. He could hear it now. The low, guttural whispers of the dead, the souls of those who had been buried in this cursed ground. With every step the figure took, James felt his legs grow weaker, as if gravity itself was turning against him. His feet refused to move, glued to the ground by an invisible force. He could feel the cold breath of the figure as it drew closer, the air growing colder still. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the figure's hand outstretched, reaching for him. James woke with a start, gasping for breath, his heart hammered in his chest. He was back on the trail, lying on the ground, drenched in sweat, as if he had been knocked unconscious. The woods around him were quiet again, too quiet. He stumbled to his feet, disoriented, and looked around. Had it all been a dream? But the moment he stood up, his eyes landed on the ground beside him. A small doll lay there, its eyes staring up at him, empty and cold. It was one of the dolls he had seen in the cemetery, one that wasn't supposed to be there. James couldn't breathe. He didn't know how, but somehow the forest had followed him. He wasn't alone anymore, and the whispers would never stop. The first time Jake saw movement behind the vent, he dismissed it as a trick of the light. But then came the breathing. Slow, deliberate, watching. At night, the grate would rattle softly, as if someone were testing it. He had moved into the apartment 2 weeks ago, lured by the cheap rent and the landlord's eagerness to get him to sign the lease. It was a decent place, small but livable, with outdated wallpaper peeling at the corners and a faint musty smell that lingered in the vents. The landlord had brushed it off, saying it was an old building, and things like that were normal. The first few nights were uneventful, save for the occasional creak of the walls settling. But by the end of the first week, Jake began to notice strange things. The unsettling quiet in the hallways, the way the air always smelled damp, and most disturbingly, the sensation that he was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. Every night, when the apartment was silent and the streetlights outside flickered, he swore he could hear faint, shallow breathing coming from the vent near his bed. At first, he told himself it was just the air ducts, the way old buildings groaned and sighed with age. But the sound was too deliberate, too human. It would start softly, almost hesitant, then deepen as if whoever, or whatever, was behind the vent was getting closer, inhaling deeply, savoring his presence. One night, he gathered enough courage to crouch beside the vent, his heart hammering. "Hello?" he whispered. No response. He exhaled and pressed his ear to the cool metal slats. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, a whisper, so close it could have been inside his own head. "You're new." Jake recoiled, scrambling back. His pulse roared in his ears. The voice had been soft, almost conversational, but there was something wrong with it. Something thin and stretched, as if it didn't belong in a human throat. He stared at the vent, his breath coming in short gasps. The room was empty. He was alone, but someone was in the walls. The next morning, he called the landlord. "Hey, I think there's something wrong with the vents. I keep hearing noises, and I swear." "You're imagining things," the landlord cut him off quickly. Too quickly. "It's an old building. Airflow does weird things." Jake hesitated. "What about the previous tenant? Did they ever mention?" "They left suddenly," the landlord said flatly. "I don't know why." The line went dead. Jake spent the rest of the day convincing himself he was overreacting. He almost believed it, until night fell. The breathing returned, slower this time, controlled, as if whoever was behind the vent knew he was listening. The metal cover trembled slightly, like fingers were pressing against it from the other side. Jake couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his toolbox and marched to the vent, hands shaking as he loosened the screws. The last one clattered to the floor. He took a deep breath and pulled the grate away. The vent was dark. Too dark. The kind of darkness that swallowed the dim light from his lamp. He leaned forward cautiously, shining his phone flashlight inside. The vent stretched further than it should have, disappearing into a black void. And then he saw them. Eyes, wet, glistening, unblinking. Watching. Jake's body locked up. He wanted to move, to run, but he couldn't. The eyes didn't blink, didn't flinch. They were too low to the ground, too unnatural. The breathing grew louder, closer. Then a hand, thin, skeletal, covered in grime, emerged from the darkness, fingers curling against the metal frame. The nails were too long, too yellowed, clicking softly against the surface. The fingers tensed, as if preparing to pull. Jake stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The flashlight slipped from his grip, spinning across the floor and casting twisted shadows across the walls. A whisper slithered from the vent, amused, hungry. "I like this one." Jake lunged forward and slammed the vent cover back into place, twisting the screws with shaking hands. He staggered away, heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had convinced himself to leave. He threw his things into a bag and rushed to the door, only to find it locked. No matter how hard he twisted the knob, it wouldn't budge. The deadbolt refused to turn. From behind him, a soft scrape. Jake turned slowly. The vent cover had been removed. The breathing was right behind him. He didn't have time to scream. The house at the end of Hollow Street had been abandoned for years. No one in town spoke about it, and no one dared to enter. The windows were boarded up, the paint peeled in thick, curling strips, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds so high they nearly swallowed the rusting mailbox. But despite its emptiness, late at night, people swore they heard whispers drifting from inside. Maggie had always been drawn to things she shouldn't be. At 16, she was the type to wander into graveyards alone, press her ear against the earth, and wonder what it sounded like to be buried alive. So when she heard the stories about the abandoned house, she knew she had to see it for herself. Her best friend, Jordan, wasn't as eager. "People say someone still lives there," he warned. "Or something." Maggie just grinned. "Then let's find out." They snuck in just past midnight, slipping through a gap in the fence. The air was thick with the smell of rot and wet earth. The house loomed over them, dark and silent, but Maggie swore she felt something watching them from the broken attic window. The front door was unlocked. It groaned as she pushed it open, revealing a long hallway swallowed by shadows. The wallpaper had decayed into a curling, mold-ridden mess, and deep cracks ran through the ceiling like veins. They stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath them. The air was stale, heavy with something foul. Then the whispers started, soft at first, indistinct, the way a breeze sounds when it slips through old walls. Jordan froze. "Tell me you heard that." Maggie nodded, her pulse quickening. The whispers came again, closer, clearer. A voice, distant yet intimate, like someone speaking right against her ear. "Who's there?" Maggie spun, but the hallway was empty. Jordan grabbed her arm. "Let's go." But Maggie wasn't listening. She stepped forward, peering into the darkness. The sound of breathing filled the silence, deep, slow, and wrong. Then something moved at the end of the hall. A figure, barely visible in the dim light. Maggie's breath caught. "Hello?" The figure twitched. The whispering grew frantic, words overlapping, slipping over each other in an unnatural chorus. "You shouldn't be here." The shadows shifted, and the figure stepped forward. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its skin a patchwork of rot, and something too dark to be blood. Its mouth stretched open in a silent scream, jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. Maggie stumbled backward, heart hammering. The whispers turned into wails, voices rising in agony. The figure lunged. Jordan grabbed her hand and yanked her toward the door. They ran, the whispers chasing them, wrapping around them like unseen hands. The hallway stretched, the exit impossibly far. The air grew thick, suffocating. Something cold brushed Maggie's ankle. She screamed, then the door was there. Jordan shoved it open, and they tumbled outside, gasping. The whisper stopped. The air was still. The house stood silent behind them, just as empty as before. But as they ran, Maggie swore she heard one last whisper. "See you soon." Lena's new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. After breaking off a toxic relationship and moving across the country, she wanted nothing more than peace, quiet, and a place where no one knew her name. The rent was suspiciously cheap, but she didn't question it. A top-floor unit with a balcony, decent space, and a landlord eager to hand over the keys, what was there to complain about? Her first night was uneventful, save for the slight chill that seemed to linger no matter how high she turned up the heat. The apartment had been empty for months, the landlord had said, so it was probably just settling. By the third night, she started noticing it, the scratching. It was faint at first, like the scurrying of a mouse inside the walls, but as the hours crept past midnight, it grew louder, more deliberate. Not the erratic movement of an animal, but something slow, purposeful. Lena lay awake, listening, her pulse quickening. The sound came from the closet. She told herself it was nothing. Old pipes, maybe. The building was old after all. She turned over, willing herself to sleep. Then, tap, tap, tap. 3 distinct knocks from inside the closet. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, staring at the closed door. The room was dark, the only light spilling in from the street lamp outside. The tapping came again. She swallowed hard. Hello? Silence. She forced a nervous laugh. Maybe she was imagining things. Stress did that to people. Then the knob twisted. She bolted upright. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but she couldn't move. She stared as the knob slowly, painfully turned left, then right, rattling against the latch. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Lena held her breath, waiting. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then from behind the door, a whisper. I know you're awake. Lena scrambled out of bed, grabbed her phone, and switched on the flashlight. The closet door was still closed, but something was wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped forward and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just darkness and empty space. But the smell, stale, damp, wrong, clung to the air. And at the very back of the closet, where the wall should have been, there was a small, square opening. Lena's stomach turned. That hadn't been there before. A crawl space. A black hole leading into the unknown. The darkness inside it was suffocating, as if light didn't belong there. Her phone's flashlight barely reached into the space, illuminating dust-covered floorboards and something else. Something that made her blood run cold. Handprints. Small, smudged, some trailing downward as if someone had been dragged inside. Lena stepped back, heart hammering. She needed to leave. Now. She grabbed her keys and fled, not stopping until she was outside, the cold air biting her skin. She drove to a cheap motel, trying to convince herself she was overreacting. But deep down, she knew she wasn't. She barely slept. By morning, she forced herself to return, only to find her apartment door slightly open. She was certain she had locked it. The air inside was colder than before, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. She stepped in cautiously, heart pounding. Everything looked normal, except for the closet. The door stood wide open, and the crawl space, it was empty. The handprints were gone, but the smell remained, thick, rotting, lingering in the air. Then she saw it, the closet door. On the inside, etched into the wood, was a single word. Run. Lena did. She never looked back. The landlord never mentioned the tenant before her. No one stayed in that apartment for long. The house on Blackwood Lane had been empty for years. A crumbling relic of the past. Its windows were dark, its front yard consumed by weeds. Kids in the neighborhood whispered stories about it. Tales of people who entered and never came out, of strange sounds in the night, of something watching from the upstairs window. For Danny and his friends, it was the perfect place for a dare. No one's lived here in decades, Jason said, his voice low as they stood outside the rusted gate. Probably rats and dust, that's all. Then you go first, Danny challenged. Jason hesitated, then pushed open the gate. It groaned in protest, the sound swallowed by the heavy silence that clung to the house. The others followed, stepping carefully up the porch steps. The front door was locked, but the side entrance, where the wood had rotted away, gave them easy access. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The floor creaked beneath their weight, and the wallpaper had peeled away in long, curling strips. "This place is falling apart," Chris muttered. Danny wasn't listening. Something about the house felt off. Not just abandoned, but wrong. As if the walls were holding a secret. as if something unseen was breathing just out of sight. Then they heard it, a noise from upstairs. Not the settling of an old house, not the skittering of rodents. Footsteps, slow, heavy, coming closer. Chris grabbed Danny's arm. "Tell me you heard that." Danny nodded. His throat was dry. Jason forced a laugh. Probably the wind. Then the footsteps ran, fast, pounding toward the staircase. Danny's stomach dropped. Jason bolted. Chris followed. But Danny froze, because for a split second before they turned and ran, he saw it. At the top of the stairs, a figure. Too tall, too thin. Its arms stretched unnaturally long, its fingers curled like claws. No eyes, just gaping, hollow sockets. And it was smiling. Danny snapped out of his trance and sprinted after his friends, his pulse thundering. They tore through the doorway across the yard and didn't stop running until they reached the street. Only then did they turn back. The house stood silent, empty. But in the upstairs window, something moved. A shadow shifting behind the glass. Watching, waiting. Danny never spoke of that night again. Neither did his friends. Because they knew the house wasn't empty. And it never had been. The ad for the babysitting job seemed too good to be true. $300 for one night, the listing read. Just watch my son while I'm out. He's already asleep. No housework required. Olivia had taken countless babysitting gigs, but never one that paid this well for so little effort. She responded immediately, and within minutes, she received a message from the homeowner. "Come at 8 p.m. Door will be unlocked. Help yourself to anything in the fridge." No introduction. No mention of the kid's name. It was odd, but Olivia shrugged it off. People were weird sometimes. At exactly 8 p.m., she arrived at the house. It was larger than expected, an old Victorian-style home standing alone at the edge of town. The yard was overgrown, the windows dark. She knocked once, no answer. She tried the door. It opened easily, just as the message had said. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and something else, something off. "Hello?" she called. No response. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor. The furniture was covered in white sheets, giving the place an abandoned feel. A note lay on the coffee table. "My son is asleep upstairs. Please do not wake him. Security cameras are on. No guests allowed. I'll be home by midnight." Olivia frowned. No contact information, no emergency numbers. She glanced at the security camera in the corner of the room. A small red light blinked. Something about the situation made her uneasy, but $300 was $300. She locked the door behind her and settled onto the couch, scrolling through her phone. An hour passed. The house was silent. Then, soft creaking from upstairs. Olivia stiffened. The kid must have woken up. She hesitated, then climbed the staircase, each step groaning beneath her weight. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open gently. The room was dark. A twin-sized bed sat in the center, covers pulled over a small lump. A nightlight glowed weakly in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the walls. "Hey, bud," Olivia whispered. "Everything okay?" No response. She took a cautious step closer. The lump under the blanket didn't move. She reached out, pulling the blanket down slightly. Pillows, stacked to resemble a sleeping child. Her stomach twisted. Then she heard it. A scratching noise, not from the bed, from the closet. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly. The closet door stood slightly open, revealing only darkness. The scratching grew louder. Something was inside. She stepped back, pulse pounding. The closet door creaked open a little more. A whisper drifted out. "Who's there?" The voice was wrong. Thin, stretched. Like a child's, but off. Olivia bolted. She tore down the stairs, grabbed her phone, and dialed the number from the ad. No answer. She tried again. Straight to voicemail. A notification popped up on her screen. New message from unknown number. "Why did you go into the room?" Her blood ran cold. A sudden noise made her spin around. The closet door at the bottom of the stairs was slowly swinging open. She didn't stay to see what was inside. She ran out of the house and didn't stop until she reached her car. Heart racing, she fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. She sped away, breathing heavily. Her phone buzzed again. New message from unknown number. "You left before midnight." She blocked the number and never looked back. The next day, she searched for the listing again. It was gone. There was no record of the house, no landlord, no child. She checked the news, hoping to find something. Instead, she found an article. Abandoned home still haunted by unsolved murder of young boy found locked in a closet. The photo of the house was the same one she had been in last night. She slammed her laptop shut, her body shaking. She never took another babysitting job again. The apartment was perfect. Too perfect. The rent was low, the location was central, and best of all, it came fully furnished. When Lauren moved in, she thought she had found an unbelievable deal. She had no idea how right she was. At first, everything seemed normal. The place was a little old, sure, but nothing a good cleaning couldn't fix. She unpacked her things, settled into her new space, and by the end of the first night, she felt completely at home. But then came the knocking. It started on the second night. A faint, rhythmic tap-tap-tap from inside the walls. Lauren assumed it was the pipes. Old buildings made weird noises. She ignored it and went to bed. The next night, it came again. Louder, closer. It didn't sound like pipes. It sounded like knuckles against wood. She pressed her ear to the wall, heart pounding. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, just as she pulled away, a whisper. "I see you," Lauren screamed, stumbling backward. She barely slept that night. By morning, she convinced herself it was a nightmare. Stress, exhaustion, it had to be. But the knocking didn't stop. Every night, it returned, always closer, always louder. She complained to the landlord, but he shrugged. Old building. You'll get used to it. She wasn't so sure. On the sixth night, she stayed up, determined to catch whoever was behind the sounds. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the knocking began. But this time, it wasn't just the walls, it was the closet. A slow, deliberate knock from inside. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the handle and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just empty space and a row of clothes. She let out a shaky laugh. She was losing her mind. Then she saw it. The closet floor had shifted. The wooden paneling was slightly raised, just an inch. Barely noticeable. A trapdoor. Her stomach clenched. She shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed at her to leave it alone. But her hand moved on its own, fingers curling around the edge. She lifted. Beneath was a small, dark crawl space. And inside, a mattress, blankets, empty food wrappers, a knife. Someone had been living there. Lauren clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Then she noticed the holes. Dozens of tiny, carved-out holes along the wall. She turned to look at her apartment. They were perfectly aligned with her bed. Whoever had been in that crawl space had been watching her. For days. Something shifted below, a rustling sound. Lauren dropped the panel and ran. She didn't stop running until she was outside, her heart pounding. She called the police. They arrived quickly, searched the apartment, and found nothing. No mattress, no food, no knife, no sign that anyone had ever been there. But Lauren knew what she had seen, and as she stood there shaking, she glanced up at her apartment window. For a split second, she saw a shadow move behind the curtains. She never went back.
She had worked at the grocery store for over 6 months. It was a quiet, almost sleepy job in a small town where everyone knew each other and nothing ever seemed to change. The shelves were stocked, the aisles were clean, and the regular customers came in like clockwork. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and most importantly, it was safe, or so she thought. Her name was Rachel, and like many people, she thought she knew everything about the place she worked. She knew the customers by their first names, the layout of the store like the back of her hand, and even the odd creaks and groans the building made late at night. There was nothing particularly unusual about the store, nothing that stood out, except for one small strange thing. The back room. The back room had always been a mystery, a place that no one really talked about. It wasn't part of the regular store space. It was a small cluttered area where boxes of old stock were stored, a place that wasn't really used except for the occasional restocking. It was, in essence, a forgotten space that no one bothered to enter. Rachel's manager, Tom, was an older man who had worked at the store for decades, and every time she asked about the back room, he would avoid her questions, changing the subject quickly, offering no explanations. "Don't go in there, Rachel," he would say with a nervous laugh. "It's not for you." It was an odd response. one that made Rachel uneasy every time she heard it. She had assumed it was just the old man's way of being quirky, perhaps a result of spending too much time in a job he no longer cared about. But she never pushed the issue. She figured there was nothing more to it than that, until one fateful night, when everything changed. It was a Friday evening, and the store was closing up for the night. The aisles were empty, the lights flickering slightly as the store transitioned into darkness. Most of the employees had already left, but Rachel stayed behind to finish some paperwork. The dull hum of the overhead lights was the only sound in the building, and she was beginning to feel the isolation of the empty store. She had grown used to working late, but tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, an electric charge that made her skin prickle. As she gathered the last of the receipts, Rachel heard something that made her pause, a faint noise coming from the back room. It was a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, listening intently, trying to identify the source of the noise. It wasn't just the sound of a box being moved. It sounded almost intentional, deliberate. Something, or someone, was in there. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as the wind, or perhaps an animal trying to find its way inside. But something told her that wasn't the case. The store was locked up tight, and the only people still in the building were her and Tom, who had already gone home. Rachel stood in place, weighing her options. She could leave it alone, chalk it up to imagination, and go home. But her curiosity, that insatiable urge to know, got the best of her. She had to investigate. Slowly, she stood up from the desk and made her way toward the back room. The noise had stopped, but the sense of unease lingered. The hallway leading to the back room was dimly lit, the flickering bulbs casting eerie shadows on the walls. As Rachel reached the door, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, but enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond it. She had never left the door open before, nor had anyone else. It was always locked when she worked late. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. As soon as the door creaked open, the smell hit her, a musty, dank odor that immediately made her gag. It wasn't the smell of old stock or spoiled food. It was something else, something unpleasantly metallic and sour. Her mind raced with the possibilities, none of them comforting. Inside, the room was dim, illuminated only by the faint light filtering in from the hallway. There were stacks of boxes, some open and some closed, their contents spilling out across the floor. But it wasn't the clutter that caught her attention. It was the movement. In the far corner of the room, near a pile of discarded cardboard, she saw something shifting. It was a figure, too tall and thin to be human, and yet, there it was, moving with a strange, jerky rhythm. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she took a hesitant step forward. She couldn't make out any details, but there was no mistaking the fact that something, or someone, was in the room with her. Her mind screamed at her to turn around and run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was frozen, her body betraying her instincts. Then the figure turned. It was a person. No, it was more than that. The thing in front of her had a face, but it wasn't a human face. Its skin was too pale, stretched thin over hollow bones, and its eyes were black, voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. It was looking directly at her, its mouth stretching into a grotesque grin that made her stomach twist in horror. Rachel took an instinctive step back, but the thing didn't move. It just stared at her, unblinking, as if waiting for something. She didn't know what to do. Should she scream, run? The only thing she could manage was to raise her hand, shakily reaching for the door handle. But as she did, the creature took a step forward, and with it, the room seemed to grow colder, darker, The very air in the room became suffocating. "I shouldn't be in here," Rachel stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The creature's grin widened, impossibly wide, and then it spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that echoed through the room. "You weren't supposed to find it." The words sent a chill down her spine. It was as if the thing knew exactly what she was thinking, as if it had been waiting for her. It didn't move any closer, but the air around her felt thick, like the walls were closing in. Her breath quickened, and she realized that the creature wasn't alone. There were others, shapes, hidden in the shadows of the room, watching her. Without thinking, she yanked the door open and bolted out of the room, her feet pounding against the floor. As she raced down the hallway, the thing's whispering laughter followed her, growing fainter as she reached the front of the store. She didn't stop running until she was outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she fumbled with her keys, desperate to lock up and leave. She could feel the eyes of the creature upon her, even though she couldn't see it anymore. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she could still hear its voice in her head, taunting her, warning her. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. The image of the creature's face haunted her thoughts, its black eyes never leaving her mind. She wanted to forget what she had seen, to dismiss it as a figment of her imagination. But deep down, she knew it was real. The store was hiding something dark, something dangerous. The next day, she tried to act normal, like nothing had happened. But as she walked past the back room, she saw Tom standing in front of the door, staring at it with a blank expression. He didn't say anything, but she could see it in his eyes. He knew exactly what was in that room, and as he glanced at her, she could see the fear in his face. It wasn't just the back room, it was everything. The store had always been a cover, a trap, a place to hide whatever was lurking in the shadows, and now it had claimed her too. Rachel never went back inside that room again. She left the job, packed up, and moved far away. But no matter where she went, the creature's voice would follow her, reminding her that there are things in the dark that should never be disturbed. Lena had always loved her dog, Daisy. She'd adopted the golden retriever when she was a college student, and they had been. Daisy was more than just a pet. She was a loyal companion, a source of comfort, and a constant presence in Lena's life. The two of them had been through thick and thin together, late-night study sessions, long walks, and lazy Sunday afternoons. Daisy was her best friend, and Lena couldn't imagine life without her. But lately something had been off. It started small, just little things at first, tiny subtle changes that Lena brushed off as a result of stress or exhaustion. At night, Daisy would bark at the air, her tail wagging furiously, as if she were greeting an old friend. But there was never anyone there. Lena had assumed it was just the wind, or some random noise outside that only Daisy could hear. Then one evening, things took a darker turn. It was a cold, rainy night, the kind where the rain hammered against the windows in relentless waves. Lena had just gotten home from work, and was looking forward to a quiet evening with Daisy. The apartment was dark, save for the dim light from the living room lamp, and the sound of rain against the glass created a calming, peaceful atmosphere. But as Lena set her things down and walked into the living room, she felt a strange unease. The air was thick with tension, and Daisy was staring at the door, her fur bristling, her body stiff. "Daisy," Lena called out, but the dog didn't respond. She was fixated on the door, her eyes wide and unblinking. Lena frowned, her steps slow and cautious as she approached her dog. "What is it, girl?" she asked softly, bending down to pet her. But Daisy didn't react. She just kept staring at the door, her body trembling slightly. Lena followed Daisy's gaze, but the hallway beyond the living room was empty. There was no one there, just the same quiet, empty apartment. She shook her head, trying to push away the unsettling feeling that had crept up on her. It was probably nothing. Daisy was just being strange. Dogs did that sometimes, didn't they? But still, a sense of unease gnawed at her. She sat down on the couch and reached for the remote, trying to distract herself. The dog, however, remained fixated on the door, her head tilted slightly, ears pricked. It was like Daisy was waiting for something, or someone. The tension in the air felt heavy, and Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Then it happened again. A low growl escaped Daisy's throat. It was a soft guttural sound that sent a chill down Lena's spine. Her dog's eyes were now fixed on the door, with an intensity that was almost predatory. Lena felt her pulse quicken, her heart pounding in her chest. "Daisy, what's wrong?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. But Daisy didn't move. She didn't bark or whimper. She just growled, her body tense as though she were preparing for something. Lena felt a cold sweat trickle down her back. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. This wasn't like Daisy. Her dog had never acted this way before. Lena's mind raced with possible explanations. Maybe a squirrel or a stray cat had wandered too close to the apartment, triggering Daisy's protective instincts. But no, this felt different. There was something in the air, something dark and malevolent. Just as Lena was about to stand up and investigate, she heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the door. It was faint at first, like something scraping against wood. Lena froze, her breath caught in her throat. She glanced down at Daisy, who was now standing, her body rigid with tension, her growl louder and more ferocious. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if someone, was trying to get inside. The noise was unmistakable. It was too deliberate to be an animal. It was too purposeful, too eerie. Lena's heart began to race, and she could feel a knot forming in her stomach. She slowly stood up, her legs unsteady, and took a cautious step toward the door. "Daisy, stay back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As she reached the door, the scratching stopped. Silence. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows, the wind howling outside. Lena stood there, her hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure of what to do. Her instinct screamed at her to leave the door, locked and run. But curiosity and fear kept her rooted to the spot. She took a deep breath and slowly opened the door, her hand trembling as she gripped the handle. The hallway beyond was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the living room. She peered into the darkness, straining her ears to listen. The air was thick with silence. Then out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a shadow. It was fleeting, just a flicker of movement in the darkness, but it was enough to make Lena's blood run cold. Something, or someone, was in the hallway, and it was watching her. She gasped, her body jerking back in fear. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. Daisy's growl had stopped, replaced by a low whine, and the dog was now cowering behind Lena, her eyes wide and fearful. It was as if Daisy knew something Lena didn't, something in the darkness, something that shouldn't be there. Lena stepped into the hallway, her breath shallow, her mind racing. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she knew deep in her gut that something was wrong. As she walked down the dark corridor, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Her heart thudded in her chest as the footsteps grew louder. She turned to look at Daisy, who was still cowering behind her. But then she heard it, a voice, a whisper, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It was a man's voice, and it was coming from the end of the hallway. "Come closer," the voice whispered, the words sending a shiver down Lena's spine. "I'm waiting for you." Lena's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from anyone she knew. It wasn't Tom, her neighbor, or any of her friends. It wasn't even her own thoughts. The voice was foreign, a sinister presence that sent waves of terror crashing over her. "Who's there?" Lena called out, her voice trembling, but there was no answer. Only the echo of her own words, and the oppressive silence that followed.
She backed away slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, until she felt the cold wall of the hallway against her back. Daisy, still trembling, stayed close to her side, the dog's whimpering becoming louder, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. The voice was gone, the hallway was silent again, but the oppressive feeling lingered, the weight of something unseen hanging in the air. Lena stood there, paralyzed with fear. She didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear. The apartment, the place she had always called home, had become something else. Something was here, in the darkness, and it was waiting. Lena didn't stay another minute. She grabbed Daisy's leash and rushed out of the apartment, never looking back. Whatever was in that hallway, whatever had been trying to make contact with her, would have to remain in the shadows. She wasn't going to stick around to find out. She couldn't, because deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The scratching, the footsteps, the voice, this was just the beginning. And Daisy knew it too, as the two of them hurried down the stairs and out into the cold night. Lena felt the dog's body stiffen, its eyes wide with terror, as if the creature that had been waiting was still out there, just beyond the walls. The silence followed them into the night, but the unease never left. At first the notes were easy to dismiss, strange, but harmless. A family living in an old house, settling into their new life, was bound to come across a few oddities. But as the notes kept appearing, as the messages grew more chilling, Sarah and her family couldn't ignore it any longer. They had moved into the house 6 months ago. The house was charming in a vintage, rustic way, a perfect place to raise their young children, a place with character. The house had a long history, built in the early 1900s, and passed down through generations. It had a welcoming atmosphere, complete with creaky floorboards, towering windows, and a large fireplace in the living room that they loved to gather around. The family, Sarah, her husband Mark, and their 2 children, Emma and Lucas, had begun to settle in and embrace the idea of creating new memories here. But the first note had been left on the kitchen table one morning. "Check the vents," it read in neat, almost polite handwriting. No signature, no explanation, just those 3 simple words that gave Sarah an uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. She assumed it was a prank, maybe a former tenant, or someone with a sick sense of humor. She had mentioned the note to Mark, and they both shrugged it off, but there was a lingering sense of discomfort that Sarah couldn't ignore. It was an old house after all, and things could easily go unnoticed over time. Maybe it was a maintenance reminder, or something left behind by a previous resident. A week later, another note appeared, this time in the bathroom. "Don't forget the vents," it said in the same handwriting. It seemed more deliberate this time, more insistent. The fact that it was placed on the bathroom mirror gave Sarah a jolt. Whoever had left it had been watching her. They knew her routine. Mark was starting to feel uneasy as well. He'd gone into the attic the previous weekend to retrieve some old boxes, and there had been nothing unusual up there. Yet when he looked around, he swore he could feel eyes on him, an unsettling sensation that lingered in the back of his mind. He didn't mention it to Sarah at the time, thinking it was just his imagination. But now, with the repeated notes, it was hard to ignore. The vents were starting to become a focal point, even though they couldn't figure out why anyone would want them to be checked. The house seemed normal, maybe too normal. It felt as though someone was lurking, just out of sight, pulling the strings behind the scenes. The third note appeared in the laundry room, tucked under a pile of clothes. This time, it was a bit more cryptic. "You'll find what you're looking for when the house goes quiet." Sarah's heart raced as she read them. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She looked around the room, her pulse quickening. The laundry room was at the back of the house, tucked away from the rest of the rooms. No one ever went back there, unless it was laundry day. And yet, the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her only grew stronger. She had to do something. There was no way she could ignore it any longer. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Sarah sat down with Mark in the living room, her eyes tired, but filled with determination. "We need to check the vents," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. The fear in her eyes was enough to make Mark pause, his fingers stilling over the remote control. He knew something was off. They both did. The decision was made. After a long and uncomfortable silence, they both stood up and began walking through the house. The sense of dread that had been slowly building over the past weeks felt suffocating now. The house, which had once been a warm and inviting place, felt suddenly cold, unfamiliar, as if it were holding its breath. The first vent they checked was in the living room. It was an old metal grate, covered in dust. Mark crouched down, using a screwdriver to remove it from the wall. There was a smell, faint but noticeable, a musty, almost metallic scent. As he looked inside, he saw nothing but the darkness of the vent and a few cobwebs, nothing out of the ordinary. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She stared at the vent with a sense of urgency, her heart pounding. There was something about this. Something in her gut told her there was more to this house than what met the eye. Next they checked the vent in the hallway, but again, nothing stood out. They moved through the house, checking each vent, feeling more and more like they were chasing shadows. The tension was building, their movements slower, more deliberate. The house seemed to press in around them as they moved from room to room, the air thick with an unseen weight. Finally, they reached the vent in the children's room. Mark removed the cover slowly, his face pale. A strange, unsettling feeling settled over them both as they peered inside. There was something different here, something that didn't belong. At first, they couldn't see what it was. Wonder, the tears it was. The darkness seemed to stretch forever, the space inside the vent, impossibly deep. But then Sarah noticed something, a small piece of paper wedged between the walls of the vent. She gasped, her fingers trembling, as she reached inside to pull it out. It was another note. The message on the paper was different than the others. "Stop looking, you found it." Her breath caught in her throat. This note was different, not a warning, but a statement. It felt final, the kind of finality that only comes when you've uncovered something that was meant to stay hidden. Mark stood up, his face ashen. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice unsteady. But Sarah couldn't move. She stared at the note in her hand, the words etched into her mind like a brand. There was no turning back now. The house had been hiding something, and they had uncovered it. They spent the rest of the night searching through the house, every corner, every nook and cranny, every hidden space. But they found nothing more, only the silence, pressing down on them like a weight. The house felt different now, empty, like it was waiting for something or someone. In the days that followed, things escalated. The children began to have strange dreams, dreams of a woman in a dark room, calling to them in a voice that was both familiar and terrifying. Emma would wake up crying, clutching her stuffed animal, as though it were the only thing that kept her safe. Lucas, only 5 years old, began to talk about the shadow that lived in the walls. He said it would watch him while he slept, and that it was always waiting for something. Mark and Sarah tried to brush it off, tried to convince themselves that it was just their imaginations running wild. But deep down, they knew something was wrong. The house was changing. It was as if it had become alive, watching, waiting, and then, late one night, the final note arrived. It was different than the others, darker, written in a hurried, jagged scroll. "You're not supposed to be here. Leave before it's too late." Sarah felt the cold fingers of dread clutching at her throat as she read the words. The house had been trying to tell them something all along, and now it was too late. They packed their things and left the house in the dead of night. They didn't tell anyone. They didn't explain. They just left. When they drove away, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror one last time at the house that had once been their dream home. The lights were on, the windows dark, and it stood there, silent and empty, as if waiting for the next family to make the same mistake. And as they drove farther down the road, Sarah could have sworn she saw something in the window, a face, pale and watching, her eyes wide, in silent warning.